Here is your 2,500-word script for the title. Lee Majors finally confirms what we all suspected about Farrah Fawcett. Written in the same emotional, narrative-driven tone as your competitor, but with entirely fresh wording. There are some stories Hollywood never fully tells you. Not because the truth isn't there, but because the people living that truth choose to carry it quietly. For a very long time, Lee Majors was one of those people. He never sat down in front of a camera to explain himself. He never picked up the phone to give his side of the story. He never wrote the book, or made the documentary, or gave the teary interview that everyone was probably expecting. He simply went on with his life, stayed out of the noise, and let the world draw its own conclusions. And the world did exactly that. But here is the thing about silence. It doesn't actually erase anything. It just presses it deeper. And after decades of keeping everything locked away, Lee Majors finally let something through. Just a few words. Just enough to confirm what a lot of people had quietly believed all along. That what he felt for Farrah Fawcett never really went away. And that losing her in every sense of that word was something he carried for the rest of his life. To understand why that confirmation meant so much, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to the posters, or the red carpets, or the magazine covers. You have to go back to two young people who hadn't yet become symbols of anything, who were just trying to figure out who they were and where they belonged in a city that ate people alive if they weren't careful. Lee Majors did not grow up expecting to become famous. He grew up in Kentucky, raised by relatives after losing both of his parents before he was even old enough to remember their faces. That kind of loss does something to a person. It teaches you early on not to get too attached to things, because things disappear. It teaches you to hold your emotions close and show as little vulnerability as possible. It teaches you to be strong in a quiet way, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. And if you watch Lee Majors across every role he ever played, every interview he ever gave, every moment he navigated in public life, that early lesson is written all over him. He found his way to acting not through ambition, but through accident. A football career he had worked hard to build ended with an injury, and suddenly the plan he had was gone. Acting became the door that happened to be open. He walked through it, and once he was in front of a camera, something clicked. He had the kind of face that belonged on screen, not in a showy way, but in a believable way. Audiences trusted him. Producers respected him. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he was usually the most dependable one. By the time he landed the role that would define the first chapter of his career, he had already done the hard work of proving himself. The Big Valley gave him a platform. He used it carefully. He didn't party his way through Hollywood or court controversy. He showed up, did the work, and quietly became someone that people wanted to watch. That steadiness was rare in an industry that often rewarded chaos. Farrah Fawcett arrived in Los Angeles from a completely different world. She came from Texas, from a family that loved her, from a childhood full of warmth and cheerleading and beauty pageants, and a smile so bright it seemed almost impossible to look directly at. She was beautiful in a way that could have easily made her two-dimensional, just another pretty face standing in front of cameras, waiting to be photographed. But Farrah was never just that. There was something alive behind her eyes, something curious and warm and genuinely kind that came through in everything she did. People didn't just look at her. They liked her. And that combination, the beauty and the likability, was the thing that would eventually make her one of the most recognizable women on the planet. When she and Lee crossed paths at a party in the late 1960s, neither of them was yet at the peak of what their careers would become. He was further along in terms of visibility, but she was rising fast, and the people around her already sensed it. What happened between them that night wasn't some perfectly scripted Hollywood romance. It was simpler and more human than that. They connected. Something felt easy and real. They started spending time together. And slowly, carefully, what began as a friendship became something much deeper. They dated for years before they married. By 1973, when they made it official, they had already been through enough together to understand each other in ways that newer couples couldn't. He had watched her grow. She had watched him at his most grounded. Their wedding wasn't a spectacle. They weren't trying to perform love for the cameras. They were just two people who had decided to build a life together. For a while, it worked. Lee was starring in The $6 Million Man, a show that turned him into a genuine television phenomenon. Millions of families tuned in every week. His face was everywhere. And at the same time, Farrah was picking up momentum in her own right, appearing in commercials and small television roles, quietly building the foundation of something that was about to become enormous. Lee talked about her in interviews during that period with a pride that felt completely unguarded. He believed in her. He told anyone who would listen that she was talented, that she was special, that the world would eventually figure out what he had already known for years. That kind of support, coming from someone who was already at the level she was trying to reach, meant everything. She wasn't just his wife. She was his partner in the truest sense of the word. But then 1976 happened, and everything changed. Charlie's Angels didn't just make Farrah Fawcett famous. It made her into something that happens maybe once in a generation. Almost instantly, she became the face of an era. The poster alone, that single image of her in a red swimsuit with her hair catching the light and her smile wide open and completely unguarded, sold over 12 million copies. 12 million. That number is almost impossible to process. It meant that her face was hanging on walls in bedrooms and dorm rooms and living rooms across the entire country. She wasn't a celebrity anymore. She was a cultural moment. And Lee Majors, the man who had loved her before any of that existed, suddenly found himself watching from a distance as the woman he had married became public property. Fame on that scale is a machine. It doesn't ask what you want. It doesn't check in on your marriage or your private life or the quiet dinners you used to have before the whole world started knocking on your door. It just takes. And what it took from Lee and Farrah was the most ordinary but irreplaceable thing they had: time together. The schedules became impossible. The demands on her multiplied daily. Every brand wanted her. Every magazine needed her on the cover. Every event required her presence. And Lee, who understood what it meant to be famous, who had built his own career on hard work and discipline, tried to meet her somewhere in the middle. He asked if her filming schedule could be adjusted just slightly so they could share a few evenings a week. A meal. Some time at home. The smallest possible slice of normalcy inside an increasingly abnormal life. She said no. And the reason she gave, that she didn't want to be seen making career decisions based on her marriage, was understandable in the context of who she was becoming. She was fighting to be seen as her own person, not as an extension of her more established husband. She had a right to that fight. But for Lee, hearing that answer was something he never fully recovered from. He had given her everything: his support, his belief, his loyalty, and his patience. And in that moment he realized that the gap between them had grown wider than he had allowed himself to admit. The distance wasn't just about schedules anymore. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed by adjusting a calendar. What came next was the part that truly broke him. Ryan O'Neal was not a stranger. He was someone Lee knew, someone he had crossed paths with professionally, someone who had existed in the same circles, attended the same events, shared mutual acquaintances. And when photographs began appearing in tabloids showing Farrah and Ryan together, holding hands and smiling and looking completely comfortable with each other, Lee didn't just feel heartbroken. He felt blindsided and betrayed in a way that hits differently when the person involved is someone you actually knew. He found out the way strangers find out. Through pictures in a magazine. Not through a conversation. Not through any kind of private acknowledgement. Just through images published for public consumption, as if his feelings were part of the story being sold. He didn't respond. He didn't call a reporter. He didn't release a statement. He didn't show up anywhere demanding to be heard. He went quiet, and he stayed quiet, for years, for decades. While the world watched Farrah and Ryan play out their complicated, messy, deeply public love story, Lee simply removed himself from the narrative entirely. He stopped appearing at events where she might be. He turned down interviews that wanted to probe his personal life. He acted as if that entire chapter had been sealed and set aside somewhere he didn't plan to visit again. People interpreted that silence in different ways. Some thought he was cold. Some thought he had moved on without any lasting damage. Some assumed he had simply buried everything under work and time and new relationships. But the people who actually knew him described something else entirely. They described a man who had changed in a way that wasn't immediately visible, but was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. He was charming, yes. He was professional and present and still carried that easy confidence that had always made him compelling. But he didn't let anyone in the way he once had. He built something around himself, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He had loved someone deeply and lost them in the most public way imaginable. He was not going to let that happen again. He married once more years later. He had relationships. He continued working, continued showing up, continued building a life that looked full from the outside. But those close to him never quite shook the feeling that something had closed off in him permanently after Farrah. That she had taken something with her when she left that he never really got back. In the early 2000s, a mutual friend apparently floated the idea of a private reunion. No press, no cameras, just a conversation between two people who had once meant everything to each other. Farrah was said to be open to it. Enough years had passed, and enough had happened that the idea of sitting across from the man she had once loved and simply talking seemed possible. Lee listened. He thought about it. He even admitted quietly that he missed the version of her he had known before everything exploded. But ultimately, he declined. He had spent too long building a life on the other side of that door to walk back through it. Then came the diagnosis. In 2006, Farrah was told she had a rare and aggressive cancer. The world watched as she fought it publicly and honestly, documenting her experience in a way that few people would ever have the courage to do. Lee watched from a distance. He didn't visit. He didn't speak publicly about what was happening. But people who knew him said he followed every update, said he was affected in ways he simply didn't know how to express out loud. When she died in June 2009, he released a single sentence. She was an angel on earth, and now an angel forever. That was it. No interview. No public appearance. No eulogy delivered in front of cameras. Just those words, and then silence again. He didn't go to the funeral, and some people didn't understand that. They expected something more visible from a man who had once been her husband, who had once been the most important person in her world. But that absence wasn't about indifference. It was the only honest response he had left. Going would have meant standing in a room full of grief and cameras and expectations, forced to perform a feeling that had always been too private and too painful for performance. Staying away was the most real thing he could do. What Lee Majors finally confirmed, through that single sentence, and through every year of silence that preceded it, was something that many people had suspected but never quite heard him say. That Farrah had mattered to him in a way that outlasted the marriage, outlasted the betrayal, outlasted the decades of distance and silence and moving on. That you can build a whole life after losing someone and still carry the weight of what that person meant to you. That some love stories don't end cleanly. They just go quiet. And sometimes the quietest confirmations are the ones that tell you everything.